Welcome, I'm John, and today I'm going to tell you an exciting story. The nanny was fired for stealing, but the little girl revealed the truth to her dad, the CEO. The Holloway mansion stood like a glass monument against the Connecticut sky, all sharp angles and polished surfaces that reflected everything but revealed nothing. Inside, Richard Holloway moved through rooms that echoed with absence, his footsteps muted by Persian rugs that cost more than most people earned in a year. He was 42, though grief had carved lines around his eyes that made him look older. 2 years had passed since cancer had stolen his wife, Claire, and in those 2 years, he had mastered the art of presence without participation. His daughter Emily was 8 years old, with her mother's chestnut hair and a quiet sadness that broke hearts. She ate breakfast alone at a dining table built for 12, her small frame dwarfed by the high-backed chair, her feet dangling above marble floors. The housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, would set out organic yogurt and fresh berries arranged in a perfect circle, but Emily rarely finished them. She would trace patterns in the condensation of her orange juice glass, writing invisible words only she could read. Richard saw her in passing, a blur of school uniform as he grabbed his coffee, a goodnight kiss planted on her forehead while she pretended to sleep. He told himself he was providing for her. The best schools, the best clothes, the best of everything money could buy. Everything except the one thing she needed, him. When the third nanny quit, citing communication difficulties, which was corporate speak for a boss who never spoke at all, Mrs. Chen took matters into her own hands. She remembered a young woman from her church's outreach program, someone gentle and desperate for a chance. Sophie Lane arrived on a gray October morning with everything she owned in a single canvas duff case. She was 26 but looked younger, with the kind of beauty that poverty couldn't quite hide. Clear green eyes, honey-colored hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and hands that trembled slightly when she shook Richard's hand. The interview lasted 7 minutes. Richard asked 3 questions, barely looked up from his phone, and nodded to Mrs. Chen to handle the paperwork. He didn't see the faded bruise on Sophie's wrist, covered poorly with foundation. He didn't notice how she flinched when he raised his hand to check his watch. He saw only someone to fill a position, to clock in and clock out, to become part of the invisible machinery that kept his household running while he pretended his life had order. But Emily saw something different. That first afternoon, Sophie sat cross-legged on Emily's bedroom floor, a room decorated in shades of pink that Claire had chosen, that Emily now hated, and simply waited. She didn't speak, didn't force conversation, just pulled a worn paperback from her bag and began to read silently, giving the child space to be curious. Emily watched from her bed, hugging a stuffed rabbit that had been loved nearly bald. After 10 minutes, she whispered, "What are you reading?" Sophie looked up, smiled softly. "Charlotte's Web. Have you read it?" Emily shook her head. "Would you like me to read it to you?" Something in Sophie's voice, gentle, asking rather than telling, made Emily nod. She climbed down from her bed and sat beside this stranger who didn't feel like a stranger at all. Sophie began to read, her voice wrapping around words like a warm blanket, and for the first time in months, Emily felt the tight knot in her chest begin to loosen. Upstairs in his office, Richard was on his 4th conference call of the day, negotiating a merger worth 8 figures. He didn't hear his daughter's laughter floating up through the vents. Small, hesitant at first, then growing stronger. The sound of something frozen beginning to thaw. Mrs. Chen heard it, though. She paused in the hallway, closed her eyes, and whispered a prayer of gratitude. The house, for one brief moment, felt less like a mausoleum and more like a home. Outside, the first snow of the season began to fall, covering everything in white, beautiful, temporary, and fragile as trust. 3 weeks passed, and the Holloway mansion transformed in small, nearly invisible ways. Emily's bedroom curtains stayed open now, letting morning light spill across floors that had been kept in permanent twilight. The stack of untouched picture books on her nightstand had dwindled as Sophie read to her each evening, their voices mingling in the quiet ritual of storytelling. In the kitchen, Mrs. Chen noticed Emily actually finishing breakfast, occasionally even asking for seconds. Sophie moved through the house like a ghost who had learned to haunt gently. She woke at 5:30 each morning in her small room off the kitchen, barely larger than a closet, with a narrow bed and a window overlooking the service entrance. She would sit on the edge of that bed for 10 minutes, breathing slowly, reminding herself that she was safe here, that the locked door stayed locked because she wanted it to, not because someone had trapped her inside. The bruises had faded. The nightmares came less frequently, but the fear lived in her bones, a constant companion she had learned to carry quietly. She never spoke about where she came from. When Mrs. Chen asked gentle questions over morning coffee, Sophie would smile and redirect the conversation. When Emily asked why she didn't have any family photos, Sophie said some stories were better left as mysteries. The truth, a boyfriend whose love had turned into fists, a mother who chose him over her own daughter, the escape in the middle of the night with nothing but what she could carry, stayed locked behind her careful smiles. Emily didn't need to know those details. What Emily needed was consistency, gentleness, and someone who showed up. Sophie could give her that. It was perhaps the only thing she could give. They fell into rhythms. After school, they would sit at the kitchen counter, not the formal dining room, and Emily would do homework while Sophie prepared snacks. Apple slices with peanut butter arranged into funny faces, crackers and cheese cut into stars, small things that made Emily giggle, that made the enormous house feel less empty. "Why do you always make shapes?" Emily asked one afternoon, watching Sophie cut a sandwich into a heart. Sophie paused, the knife hovering. "Because food tastes better when it's made with care. My grandmother taught me that. She said every meal is a chance to show someone they matter." "Did your grandmother make shapes for you?" "Every single day," Sophie said softly. And for just a moment, her eyes held a sadness that Emily recognized, the same sadness she saw in her own mirror. "I miss my mom," Emily whispered. Sophie set down the knife and pulled the little girl into her arms. "I know, sweetheart. I know." They stayed like that, two people who understood loss, holding each other in a kitchen that cost more than Sophie would earn in 5 years. Richard saw them when he came home early that Thursday, an unusual occurrence prompted by a canceled meeting. He stood in the doorway, briefcase in hand, watching his daughter cry into the shoulder of a woman he barely knew. Something twisted in his chest, uncomfortable and unfamiliar. Guilt, perhaps, or recognition of his own failure. He cleared his throat. They jumped apart. "Emily, you have your piano lesson in an hour," he said, his voice flat, professional. "Make sure you practice your scales." "Yes, Daddy," Emily said quietly, wiping her eyes. Richard nodded at Sophie, a curt acknowledgement of her presence, and retreated to his office. He closed the door, loosened his tie, and poured himself 2 fingers of scotch even though it was only 4 in the afternoon. Through the window, Greenwich spread out below him in shades of autumn gold and amber, beautiful and distant. In the kitchen, Sophie helped Emily wash her face with a cool cloth. "Your father loves you very much," she said, though she didn't quite believe her own words. "He loves his computer more," Emily said, matter of fact, 8 years old and already understanding abandonment. Sophie didn't correct her. Some truths were too honest to deny. That night, after Emily was asleep, Sophie sat in her small room and counted the money she had saved. 3 weeks of wages, minus what she sent to a women's shelter anonymously. It wasn't much, but it was hers, earned through honest work, through showing up, through caring. She pressed the bills flat, stored them in an envelope under her mattress, and allowed herself a moment of pride. She was building something, slowly, carefully, a life that couldn't be taken away by someone else's fists or lies. Outside her window, the first real cold snap of November settled over Connecticut, frost creeping across glass like fingers of ice reaching for warmth they would never find. December arrived with the kind of cold that made breath visible and bones ache. The Holloway mansion transformed into something from a magazine spread. Mrs. Chen supervised the decoration crew as they wrapped garland around banisters and positioned a 12-foot tree in the foyer. White lights twinkled against glass walls, creating reflections that multiplied beauty into infinity. It should have felt magical. Instead, it felt like a museum exhibit, how wealthy people celebrate Christmas. Emily stood at the base of the tree, staring up at its perfect ornaments, each one designer-made, each one placed with mathematical precision by professionals. Nothing about it belonged to her. Nothing carried memories. "Do you like it?" Richard asked, appearing from his office with his phone pressed to his ear, muting the call for this brief interruption of parenting. "It's pretty," Emily said, which wasn't the same as yes. He nodded, unmuted himself, and disappeared back into his world of mergers and acquisitions. Sophie found Emily there an hour later, still staring at the tree with an expression that broke hearts. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" "Mom and I used to make ornaments," Emily said quietly. "Out of clay. They were ugly and lumpy, but they were ours. Daddy threw them all away. Sophie's chest tightened. I'm sure he didn't mean. He said they didn't match the aesthetic. Emily's voice was matter of fact, but her eyes shimmered with unshed tears. What's an aesthetic? It means the way something looks. But sometimes grown-ups forget that the most beautiful things are the ones made with love, not the ones that match. Emily looked up at her. Can we make new ones? Sophie glanced toward Richard's office, visible through the glass walls. He was pacing, gesturing emphatically at whoever was on the other end of his call. She made a decision that felt like a small rebellion. Get your coat. They walked to a craft store 3 blocks away. Sophie's first time leaving the mansion grounds during work hours, a violation of the unwritten rules she was supposed to follow. But Emily's hand in hers felt right, and the little girl's excitement as they browsed aisles of glitter and paint made the risk worthwhile. They spent the afternoon at the kitchen table, creating ornaments from salt dough. Emily made a snowman with a lopsided smile. Sophie crafted a star that was more abstract than accurate. They laughed at their imperfect creations, flour dusting their hair, paint smudged on their cheeks. These are much better than the fancy ones, Emily declared, holding up her snowman. They're perfect because they're yours, Sophie agreed. They hung them on the tree after dinner, tucking them toward the back where they wouldn't disrupt the professional design. Emily stood back, satisfied, seeing herself reflected in something in this house for the first time in years. Richard came home late that night. He loosened his tie as he walked through the foyer, barely glancing at the tree. Then he stopped, frowned, leaned closer. There, half hidden behind a crystal ornament, was a lumpy salt dough snowman with button eyes. He should have been annoyed. These homemade decorations disrupted the carefully curated image. But as he stared at that imperfect snowman, something inside him cracked, just slightly, like ice beginning to thaw. He found Sophie in the kitchen, cleaning up the last of the dinner dishes. Did you take Emily out today? His voice was neutral, impossible to read. Sophie's hand stilled in the soapy water. Yes. We went to the craft store. I should have asked permission. I'm sorry. What did you buy? Supplies to make ornaments. Emily mentioned she used to make them with her mother, and I thought, Claire loved making those. Richard interrupted, his voice barely above a whisper. He was staring at the counter, at a fleck of paint that hadn't been wiped away. I got rid of them all. After she died, I couldn't look at them without... He didn't finish. Couldn't finish. Sophie dried her hands slowly. Emily needed to create something again. To have something on that tree that feels like hers. Richard nodded once, then retreated to his office. But before he closed the door, he paused. Thank you, he said, so quietly Sophie almost didn't hear it. In his office, surrounded by screens and spreadsheets, Richard opened his desk drawer. Inside was a photograph he kept hidden, Claire and Emily, covered in paint, laughing at some shared joke he hadn't been present for because he'd been working, always working. He picked up the watch beside the photo, his father's Patek Philippe, worth more than most people's cars. A family heirloom passed down through generations of Holloway men. He turned it over in his hands, feeling its weight, and wondered when objects had become more important than people. Outside, snow began to fall again, each flake unique and imperfect and beautiful. The house staff operated on an invisible schedule that Sophie had learned to navigate carefully. Tuesdays, the cleaning crew came through like a synchronized machine, vacuuming, dusting, polishing every surface until it gleamed. Thursdays were for deep cleaning the upstairs offices and bedrooms. Sophie stayed out of their way, kept Emily occupied, and tried not to think about how much money was spent maintaining a house that barely felt lived in. On a gray Wednesday afternoon, Richard's assistant called with a problem. The merger documents he needed for tomorrow's board meeting were in his home office, and he was stuck in Manhattan traffic. Could someone scan and email them immediately? Mrs. Chen was at a doctor's appointment. The cleaning crew had left hours ago. Sophie stood in the kitchen, phone pressed to her ear, trying to understand the urgency in the assistant's clipped tone. I can do it, she said finally. Just tell me what I'm looking for. Emily was at a play date, her first in months, arranged by Sophie with another child from school. The house was quiet, except for the hum of expensive appliances. Sophie climbed the stairs to the second floor, her footsteps muted by carpet that felt like walking on clouds. Richard's office was all dark wood and leather, walls lined with books he probably never read. His desk was surprisingly cluttered, not messy, but lived in, with stacks of documents, a laptop, several phones, and that watch. The Patek Philippe sat on a crystal stand beside his computer, catching light and throwing it back in fractured rainbows. Sophie had seen it before. Richard wore it to important meetings, then removed it when he came home, placing it on that stand like a religious ritual. She knew without being told that it was expensive. Everything in this house was expensive. She found the merger documents in the third drawer, exactly where the assistant said they'd be. The printer scanner sat in the corner, whirring to life as she fed pages through. While she waited, she noticed a photograph tucked behind a stack of files. Claire and Emily at a beach somewhere, both laughing, both luminous with joy. Richard wasn't in the picture. She wondered if he'd been behind the camera or simply absent. Her phone buzzed. A text from the playdate mother. "Emily is having a wonderful time. Can she stay for dinner?" Sophie smiled, typed back a yes, and sent the scanned documents. She straightened the desk carefully, making sure everything was exactly as she'd found it. On her way out, she paused at the bookshelf. Leather-bound classics, first editions probably, the kind of books bought for display rather than reading. She pulled out Jane Eyre, drawn by a memory of her grandmother reading it aloud. The binding cracked as she opened it, and she felt guilty immediately, like she was touching something forbidden. She read the first page, standing there in Richard's office, transported briefly into a world where governess Jane Eyre was dismissed and degraded, but possessed a dignity that couldn't be broken. Sophie understood that feeling intimately. She was replacing the book when she heard it, a small sound, like something falling. She turned, searching, but saw nothing. The watch still sat on its stand. The desk looked undisturbed, probably just the old house settling. She left, closing the door quietly behind her, and went to prepare dinner for one. What Sophie didn't see was the watch, knocked by her bag as she'd reached for the book, rolling off the desk and sliding behind the bookshelf, lodging itself in the narrow gap between wood and wall, invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. That evening, Richard came home earlier than usual. He went straight to his office, poured himself scotch, and sat down to review briefs for tomorrow's meeting. He worked for 2 hours before he noticed. The watch was gone. He stood abruptly, scanning the desk, the floor, the surfaces around him. Nothing. He checked drawers, moved papers, got on his hands and knees to search under the furniture. Panic rose in his chest, not because of the watch's monetary value, though it was considerable, but because it was his father's. The last tangible connection to a man who'd been as emotionally distant as Richard had become. He pulled up the security footage on his computer. The cameras in the hallway showed Sophie entering his office at 2:47 p.m. and leaving at 3:12 p.m. 25 minutes. Plenty of time. Richard's jaw tightened. He wanted to believe there was an explanation, but he'd built an empire on facts, on evidence, on eliminating variables that didn't perform as expected. And the facts were clear. The watch was there before Sophie entered his office. Now it wasn't. He sat in the dark, the scotch untouched, making calculations that had nothing to do with numbers and everything to do with trust he'd never actually given. Downstairs, Sophie tucked Emily into bed, reading the final chapter of Charlotte's Web. When she reached the part where Wilbur understands that Charlotte has died, Emily cried quietly, and Sophie held her close. "Why do the good ones always leave?" Emily whispered. Sophie didn't have an answer. She just held tighter, wishing she could promise that good things stayed, that people who cared didn't disappear. But she knew better than to make promises she couldn't keep. Richard didn't sleep that night. He sat in his office until dawn, the missing watch like a phantom limb, something he could still feel even though it was gone. He'd checked the footage 17 times, looking for anything he might have missed, but the narrative remained unchanged. Sophie was the only person who'd entered his office. Sophie was the last person to see the watch. At 6 a.m. he called his head of security. At 7 a.m. he called his attorney. At 8 a.m. he composed an email to HR with the subject line, "Immediate termination, security breach." He told himself he was being rational, objective, that this was standard protocol for theft of company property. Except the watch wasn't company property. It was personal, which made the violation feel even deeper. He told himself he couldn't have someone untrustworthy around his daughter, even as a voice in the back of his mind whispered that Emily had smiled more in the past 6 weeks than in the previous 2 years. He ignored that voice. He was good at ignoring things. By 10 a.m., everything was set in motion. A machine of corporate efficiency that couldn't be stopped even if he'd wanted to stop it. Sophie was in the playroom with Emily, helping her build an elaborate castle out of blocks. They'd been working on it all morning, each tower carefully placed. each wall precisely aligned. Emily was explaining the story of the princess who lived there, a brave girl who'd lost her mother but found magic in everyday kindness. And the princess had a friend, Emily said, placing a small wooden figure next to the castle. Someone who made her feel safe. Sophie's throat tightened. That sounds like a wonderful friend. The best friend, Emily agreed. The doorbell rang. Mrs. Chen answered it, and her gasp carried through the house. Sophie looked up to see two men in suits, one from Richard's security team, one she didn't recognize, standing in the doorway with expressions carved from stone. "Sophie Lane?" the security chief said. "Yes? We need you to come with us, please." Emily's hand found Sophie's. "What's wrong?" "I'm sure it's nothing, sweetheart," Sophie said, but her voice trembled. She recognized that look in their eyes. She'd seen it before, in the faces of men who'd believed her ex-boyfriend's lies over her truth. The look that said she'd already been judged and found guilty. They led her to the foyer. Richard stood at the top of the stairs, looking down like a king, passing sentence on a subject. He wouldn't meet her eyes. "Miss Lane," the security chief said, pulling out a tablet. "Security footage shows you entering Mr. Holloway's office yesterday afternoon. A family heirloom, a Patek Philippe watch valued at over $200,000, went missing during that time. Do you know anything about its whereabouts?" The number made Sophie dizzy. $200,000. More money than she'd seen in her entire life. "I went to scan documents," she said, her voice small. "His assistant asked me to. I didn't touch anything else. I didn't—" "Your employment is terminated effective immediately," he continued as if she hadn't spoken. "A police report has been filed. You're not being arrested at this time, but you may be contacted for questioning. Please collect your personal belongings and leave the premises." The world tilted. Sophie grabbed the banister to steady herself. "Daddy?" Emily's voice cut through the foyer like a knife. "What's happening? Why are they being mean to Sophie?" Richard finally looked at his daughter. "Emily, go to your room." "No, Sophie didn't do anything wrong." "Emily!" His voice was sharp, final. "Now!" Mrs. Chen appeared, gently guiding Emily away. The little girl fought, crying, reaching back for Sophie. "Don't go! Please don't go!" Sophie wanted to run to her to explain, to promise it would be okay. But one of the men was already leading her toward her small room off the kitchen. She packed her single suitcase in 4 minutes, everything she owned in the world fitting into one bag, exactly as it had when she'd arrived. They escorted her through the front door. The rain had started, cold November rain that felt like needles against her skin. Sophie clutched her suitcase, her coat unbuttoned, her dignity shattering with each step down the marble driveway. She didn't cry, didn't beg, didn't protest her innocence because she'd learned long ago that innocence didn't matter when people had already decided who you were. At the gates, she turned back once. Through the rain-streaked glass walls, she could see Emily pressed against a window on the second floor, her small hand flat against the glass. Sophie raised her hand in goodbye, then walked into the rain, disappearing into the gray afternoon like she'd never existed at all. Inside, Richard stood in his office, the email confirmation of termination glowing on his screen. He told himself he'd done the right thing, the necessary thing, the only thing. But when he looked at his daughter's empty castle, abandoned, half-built, the wooden princess figure fallen on its side, something inside him felt like it was breaking. He just didn't know yet that it was his own heart. The Grace Haven Women's Shelter sat on the edge of Stamford, a 40-minute bus ride from Greenwich's gleaming mansions. The building was old brick, its paint peeling, its windows covered with bars that were meant for protection but felt like imprisonment. Inside, fluorescent lights hummed constantly, casting everything in a sickly yellow glow. Sophie had been there 3 days. She shared a room with 2 other women, one escaping domestic violence like herself, the other recently evicted after losing her job. They didn't talk much. The shelter had rules, no personal questions, no sharing of last names, no getting too close to anyone because closeness meant vulnerability and vulnerability was dangerous. Sophie spent her days filling out job applications on the shelter's single shared computer, each rejection email another stone added to the weight she carried. Her hands shook when she typed, and she had to keep stopping to breathe, to remind herself that she was still here, still alive, still trying. The shelter served dinner at 5:30, watery soup, stale bread, canned vegetables that tasted like the metal they came in. Sophie ate because she had to mechanically, tasting nothing. At night, she lay on a cot that smelled of industrial cleaner and other people's desperation, staring at water stains on the ceiling that looked like maps to places she'd never go. She didn't cry. She'd used up all her tears years ago. What hurt most wasn't the false accusation. She'd been blamed for things she didn't do before. By her mother, by her ex-boyfriend, by a world that always seemed ready to believe the worst about people like her. What hurt was Emily. The look on that little girl's face, the sound of her crying, the knowledge that Sophie had become another person who'd abandoned her. On the fourth morning, Sophie woke to find a small envelope on her cot. Inside was $20 and a note for the girl who sends money to others. Mrs. Chen Sophie pressed the bills to her chest and finally let herself cry. Back in Greenwich, the Holloway mansion had returned to its museum-like silence. Emily refused to eat, refused to talk, refused to leave her room except for school, where her teacher reported she sat motionless at her desk, staring at nothing. Richard tried everything his limited emotional vocabulary allowed. He bought her a new iPad, offered to take her to Disney World, suggested getting a puppy. "I want Sophie," was all Emily said. "Sophie stole from us," Richard explained for the fifth time, his patience fraying. "We can't have someone like that in our home." "She didn't steal anything," Emily screamed, her face red, tears streaming. "You're lying! You're a liar!" It was the first time she'd ever raised her voice to him. Richard stood in her doorway, stunned, as his daughter collapsed onto her bed, sobbing into her pillow. The same pillow Sophie had fluffed every morning, that still somehow carried the faint scent of her lavender hand cream. He retreated to his office and poured scotch with trembling hands. His attorney called that afternoon. The police did a preliminary investigation. No watch turned up at any pawn shops or online marketplaces. No unusual deposits in her bank account. Actually, she barely has a bank account. $43 total. The detective said it's unusual for a thief to not immediately try to fence something that valuable. Richard said nothing. "Look, Richard, I have to ask, are you certain the watch was stolen? Could it have been misplaced?" "I've searched everywhere," Richard said, but even as he spoke, doubt crept in like cold air through a cracked window. That night, Emily didn't come down for dinner. Mrs. Chen brought a tray to her room and found her lying in bed, clutching the lumpy salt dough snowman she and Sophie had made. "She read to me," Emily whispered. "Every night. She made me feel safe." Mrs. Chen sat on the edge of the bed, her own eyes damp. "I know, sweetheart. Why did Daddy send her away? Because sometimes grown-ups make mistakes, even smart ones. Can mistakes be fixed?" Mrs. Chen looked at the little girl, at her red-rimmed eyes and trembling chin, and thought about Sophie in whatever place she'd ended up, alone and blamed for something she didn't do. "I don't know," she said honestly, "but I hope so." At 2 in the morning, Richard found himself standing in his office, scotch in hand, staring at the empty crystal stand where his father's watch should have been. The security footage was still paused on his computer screen, frozen on an image of Sophie leaving his office, her expression peaceful, untroubled, not the face of someone who'd just committed a crime. He thought about her trembling hands during the interview, her quiet gentleness with Emily, the way she'd brought light back into a house that had been dark for 2 years. Then he thought about the watch, about evidence, about the logical conclusion. But logic didn't explain why his chest felt hollow, why his daughter wouldn't eat, why the house felt more empty now than it had even after Claire died. He finished the scotch and went to bed, but sleep wouldn't come. Just Emily's words, playing on repeat. "You're a liar." Emily stopped sleeping. At 8 years old, she discovered that grief could keep you awake, the same way fear did. Both left you staring at the ceiling, counting the minutes until dawn. She thought about Sophie constantly. Where was she? Did she have somewhere warm to sleep? Was she scared? Emily knew what it felt like to be alone, to have people who were supposed to protect you turn away instead. Her mother had died. Her father was present but absent. And now Sophie, the first person in 2 years who'd made her feel seen, was gone too. On the 6th night, Emily gave up on sleep entirely. She slipped out of bed, her bare feet silent on the carpet, and wandered through the dark house. She ended up outside her father's office, the door slightly ajar, light spilling into the hallway. She shouldn't go in. She knew the rules. But rules had stopped mattering when Sophie was taken away. The office looked different at night, shadows turning familiar objects strange. Emily moved carefully, unsure what she was looking for but knowing she needed to find something. Some proof, some answer. She started with the desk drawers, going through them systematically like she'd seen her father do when he was searching for documents. Papers, pens, business cards, Nothing. She checked under the desk, behind the curtains, in the wastepaper basket. Nothing. She was about to give up when she saw it. Jane Eyre, the book Sophie had pulled from the shelf. Emily remembered because Sophie had shown it to her later, explaining how the governess in the story was treated poorly but never lost her dignity. "Like you," Emily had said. "Like both of us," Sophie had replied. Emily pulled the book from the shelf, and as she did, something caught her eye in the gap behind the bookcase. A glint of metal. She got on her knees, reaching into the narrow space, her small fingers just barely able to touch it. The watch. She pulled it free, her heart pounding. The Patek Philippe sat in her palm, cold and heavy and undeniably real. It hadn't been stolen. It had just fallen. An accident. A simple, terrible accident that had destroyed Sophie's life. Emily's hand started to shake, then her whole body. Rage and grief and understanding flooded through her all at once. She was too young to have the vocabulary for what she felt, but she understood injustice with the clarity that only children possess. Her father had sent Sophie away for nothing. He hadn't looked hard enough, hadn't believed her, hadn't even asked questions. He'd chosen the watch over a person. Emily clutched it tightly and walked out of the office, her mind racing. She thought about going to her father's bedroom, waking him up, demanding answers. But he'd just send her back to bed. He'd make excuses. He'd use his calm, rational voice to explain why what he'd done made sense. She needed witnesses. She needed him to face what he'd done in front of people who couldn't be dismissed. The next morning, Emily got dressed in her school uniform, went downstairs for breakfast, and acted normal. Mrs. Chen noticed something different in her eyes, a hardness that hadn't been there before, but said nothing. "Mrs. Chen," Emily said carefully, "where does Daddy work?" "At Holloway Capital in Manhattan." "Why, sweetheart?" "Just curious." At school, Emily told her teacher she felt sick. The nurse called Mrs. Chen, who picked her up at noon. But instead of going straight home, Emily asked to stop for lunch at a diner near the train station. "Please, Mom used to take me there." Mrs. Chen's eyes softened. "Of course, honey." While Mrs. Chen ordered, Emily slipped away. She'd memorized the address from papers on her father's desk. She had lunch money, enough for a train ticket. She knew it was wrong, knew she'd be in trouble, but some things were more important than rules. The train ride took 40 minutes. Emily sat with the watch in her coat pocket, her resolve hardening with each mile. Adults thought children didn't understand things, didn't see things, didn't matter. But Emily understood everything. Holloway Capital occupied 3 floors of a glass tower in Midtown. Security stopped her at the front desk. "I'm Emily Holloway," she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I need to see my father. It's an emergency." The guard hesitated, made a call. 3 minutes later, Richard's assistant appeared looking flustered. "Emily? What are you doing here? Does Mrs. Chen—" "I need to see my father. Now." Something in her tone made the assistant pause. "He's in a board meeting. It's very important." "This is more important." The assistant's phone was ringing. Probably Mrs. Chen, panicked, realizing Emily was gone. Emily didn't care. She walked toward the elevator, and the assistant, uncertain what else to do, followed. The boardroom was on the top floor, all glass walls and expensive furniture. Through the door, Emily could see 12 people in suits sitting around a massive table. Her father stood at the head, mid-presentation, pointing at charts projected on a screen. Emily didn't knock. She pushed open the door and walked in. "Emily?" Richard's face went white. "What are you—" "Daddy," she said, her voice clear in the sudden silence. "Sophie didn't steal your watch." She pulled it from her pocket and held it up for everyone to see. "You did. You stole her home when you didn't listen." The boardroom fell into a silence so complete that Emily could hear her own heartbeat. 12 executives in designer suits stared at her, some confused, some uncomfortable, all uncertain how to respond to an 8-year-old girl holding a watch worth more than their cars. Richard's face had gone from white to gray. He gripped the edge of the conference table, knuckles bloodless. "Emily, this is not the place." "Where is the place?" Her voice was stronger than she felt, powered by weeks of watching her father hide behind closed doors and corporate language. "You won't talk to me at home. You won't listen. So I came here, where you actually pay attention to things." "Emily." His voice carried a warning, but underneath it, she heard something else. Fear. "I found your watch," she continued, walking toward him, her small footsteps loud in the silence. "It was behind the bookshelf in your office. It fell. It wasn't stolen. Sophie didn't take anything except time to help you when you asked her to. She placed the watch on the conference table, its platinum case catching the fluorescent light. The Patek Philippe sat there like an accusation. You sent her away, Emily said, and now her voice cracked. You called the police. You made everyone think she was a thief, and she didn't do anything wrong. She just did what you asked. One of the board members, an older woman with silver hair, leaned forward. Richard, is this true? You accused someone of theft? Richard couldn't look at his daughter, couldn't look at anyone. He stared at the watch, that object he'd valued over a person's life, and felt something inside him fracture completely. I reviewed the security footage, he said, his voice barely audible. She was the only person in my office. The evidence isn't the same as truth, Emily interrupted. Mom used to say that. She said you have to look at people, not just facts. You have to see them. Richard's eyes finally met his daughter's, and what he saw there destroyed him. Not anger, not hatred, just profound disappointment. The look a child gives a parent when they realize the person they trusted to protect them has failed fundamentally. Where is she now? Emily asked. Where did she go? I don't know, Richard admitted, and the words tasted like ash. You didn't even check. It wasn't a question. You just threw her away, like you threw away Mom's ornaments. Like nothing matters except things that look right and cost money. The silver-haired board member stood. Richard, I think we need to adjourn this meeting. You clearly have a personal matter that requires immediate attention. Richard nodded numbly. The executives filed out, casting glances at the small girl who'd just dismantled one of Manhattan's most powerful CEOs, with nothing but honesty. The door clicked shut, leaving father and daughter alone, with the watch sitting between them like a bridge neither knew how to cross. I'm sorry, Richard said finally. His voice broke on the words. Emily, I'm so sorry. Don't say sorry to me, Emily said, tears streaming down her face now. Say it to Sophie, if you can even find her, if she'll even listen, because I wouldn't. If I was her, I'd never want to see us again. She turned to leave, and Richard felt panic rise in his chest, the same panic he'd felt when Claire died, when he realized he couldn't control everything, couldn't fix everything with money and strategy. Wait, he said. Please wait. Emily stopped at the door. Richard picked up the watch, that object his father had given him with instructions to treasure it, to pass it down, to value tradition and legacy. He looked at it now and saw it for what it was. Metal and mechanics. Replaceable. Meaningless without someone to share time with. Will you help me find her? He asked his daughter. Will you help me make this right? Emily turned, studied her father with those ancient eyes children get when they've been forced to grow up too fast. Only if you mean it. Only if you're really going to try. I mean it, Richard said, and for the first time in years, he was telling the complete truth. Emily walked back and took his hand. Her fingers were small, cold, trembling. She's at a shelter, Mrs. Chen told me. She said Sophie has nowhere else to go. The words hit Richard like a physical blow. While he'd been sleeping in 1,000-thread-count sheets, Sophie had been in a shelter. Because of him, because of his assumptions, his failure to look beyond surface evidence, his inability to see people as more than functions in his orderly world. He knelt down, eye level with his daughter. I've been a terrible father, and I was a terrible employer, but I'm going to do better, starting now. Will you give me a chance? Emily hugged him, the first real hug they'd shared since Claire's funeral. Richard held his daughter and felt everything he'd been holding back for 2 years crash over him. Grief, guilt, recognition of his own cruelty and cowardice. When they pulled apart, Emily wiped her eyes. Can we go now? She's been alone long enough. Richard nodded and stood, leaving the watch on the conference table. For once in his life, he was walking away from something valuable toward something that actually mattered. Grace Haven. Women's shelter smelled of industrial cleaner and desperation. Richard stood in the parking lot, Emily's hand in his, and felt his privilege like a weight. He'd never been to a place like this, had never considered that places like this existed just 40 minutes from his mansion. The woman at the front desk looked up with practiced wariness. She'd seen men come here before, angry men looking for women who'd escaped them. Her hand moved subtly toward a panic button beneath the desk. I'm looking for Sophie Lane, Richard said. I need to apologize to her. The woman's expression didn't soften. We don't give out information about our residents. Please, Emily said, stepping forward. Sophie took care of me. My daddy made a mistake and we need to fix it. Something in the child's voice made the woman pause. She studied Richard more carefully. His expensive suit, his obvious discomfort, the way he held his daughter's hand like she was the only thing keeping him upright. "Wait here," she said finally. 10 minutes passed. 15. Richard's phone buzzed repeatedly. His assistant, his attorney, board members wanting explanations. He silenced it. None of that mattered. When Sophie finally appeared, Richard barely recognized her. She'd lost weight she couldn't afford to lose. Her eyes were hollow, her clothes hung loose, and she moved like someone expecting violence. When she saw him, she stopped, her body going rigid. "What are you doing here?" Her voice was flat, empty of everything except exhaustion. "Sophie!" Emily pulled free from her father and ran forward, but Sophie stepped back, raising a hand. "Don't," Sophie said quietly. "Please don't make this harder." Emily froze, tears already streaming. "I found the watch. It was behind the bookshelf." "You didn't steal it. Daddy knows you didn't steal it." Sophie's eyes moved to Richard. He saw no hope there. No relief, just the numb acceptance of someone who'd been hurt too many times to feel anything anymore. "I'm sorry," Richard said. The words felt inadequate, microscopic against the enormity of what he'd done. "I was wrong. About everything. I didn't investigate properly. I didn't ask questions. I just assumed." "You assumed I was a thief because people like me are always thieves," Sophie interrupted, her voice still eerily calm. "Because I'm poor and desperate and disposable." "Yes," Richard said, and the honesty of it seemed to surprise her. "I made judgments about who you were based on nothing but my own prejudice and fear. I destroyed your reputation, your livelihood, your safety, all because I couldn't be bothered to look behind a bookshelf." "Why are you here?" Sophie asked. "To ease your conscience? To make yourself feel better about what you did?" "I want to give you your job back," Richard said. "Full pay for the time you missed. A formal apology. Clear your record with the police. Whatever you need." "I don't want your job," Sophie said, and Richard felt those words like a slap. "I don't want anything from you." "Sophie, please," Emily sobbed. "We need you. I need you." Sophie's composure cracked. She knelt down to Emily's level, tears finally spilling down her own cheeks. "Sweetheart, you don't need a nanny who your father doesn't trust. You need someone who sees you, who values you." "He does now," Emily insisted. "He's different. I made him different." Sophie looked at Richard, searching for confirmation of what seemed impossible. "People don't change," she said. "Not really, not men like—" "I know what you've survived," Richard interrupted gently. "Mrs. Chen told me about why you came to Greenwich, about what you were running from, and I know that trusting any man after that is asking the impossible. But I'm not asking you to trust me. I'm asking you to let me prove that I can be better, that I want to be better." "Why?" Sophie's voice broke. "Why does it matter?" "Because my daughter hasn't eaten in a week. Because she cries herself to sleep calling your name. Because you brought light into our house and I was too blind to see it until Emily made me look." Richard's voice shook. "And because you deserved better than what I gave you. You deserved to be believed, to be seen, to be valued as more than just someone who could be replaced." Sophie stood, wiping her eyes. "I can't come back," she said. "I can't work for someone who sees me as a suspect before seeing me as a person." "Then don't work for me," Emily said suddenly. "Be my family, not my nanny, my family." The words hung in the air between them. Richard held his breath, watching Sophie process what his 8-year-old daughter understood better than he did, that what they needed couldn't be bought or hired. It had to be chosen. "I need time," Sophie said finally, "to think, to heal, to figure out what I want my life to be." Richard nodded. "Of course, whatever you need. But please take this." He handed her an envelope. "It's not payment. It's not guilt money. It's what I owed you anyway. Your wages, and a bonus for putting up with my failure as a human being." Sophie took the envelope with trembling hands. Inside was a check that would cover 6 months of living expenses, maybe more. "There's also my personal number," Richard said, "if you need anything, or if you're willing to talk. No pressure, no expectations. Just a door that's open, if you want to walk through it." Sophie looked at Emily, at her tear-stained face and desperate hope. Then at Richard, at his obvious remorse and uncertain humility. "I'll think about it," she said. It wasn't yes, but it wasn't no. For the first time in days, Richard felt something like hope. 3 weeks passed before Sophie called. In those weeks, Richard learned what it meant to actually be a father. He left work at 5. He made dinner with Emily, burned pasta, and overcooked vegetables that they ate anyway, laughing at their mistakes. He read to her at bedtime, stumbling over words in books he'd never opened. He asked about her day and actually listened to the answers. Emily built a new castle in the playroom, bigger than before. This time, Richard helped. They worked in comfortable silence, placing blocks side by side, creating something together. "Do you think she'll come back?" Emily asked one evening. "I don't know," Richard answered honestly. "But whether she does or not, we're going to be okay. We're going to be better." Emily nodded, accepting this truth. She was learning what Sophie had already known, that strength wasn't about never falling down. It was about getting back up anyway. When Sophie finally called, Richard's hands shook as he answered. "I'd like to come by," she said, "to talk, if that's still okay." "Of course, whenever you want." She arrived on a Saturday afternoon when winter sun made the glass mansion sparkle like a crystal. Richard and Emily waited in the kitchen, not the formal living room, not his office, but the warm space where Sophie had made heart-shaped sandwiches and listened to an 8-year-old's dreams. Sophie looked different, stronger. She'd found work at a community center, teaching art to children. The hollowness had left her eyes, replaced by something harder but healthier: boundaries. "I'm not coming back as your employee," she said after they'd all sat down. "I can't." That dynamic was broken from the start. Richard nodded, his chest tight. "I understand." "But," Sophie continued, looking at Emily, "I'd like to be in your life, if you still want me, as a friend, someone who cares." "Like family?" Emily asked hopefully. Sophie smiled, and it was the first real smile Richard had seen from her since this began. "Yes, like family, the kind you choose." Over the following months, they built something new. Sophie came for dinner on Wednesdays. She and Emily had art days on Saturdays. Richard learned to step back, to not try to control or manage, to simply let relationships grow organically. He also learned to apologize publicly. He'd cleared Sophie's name with the police, but that wasn't enough. He wrote a letter to the Greenwich Employment Network, explaining his error. He made donations to women's shelters in Sophie's name. He couldn't undo the harm, but he could acknowledge it, own it, and work to prevent it from happening to others. Sophie enrolled in community college. Richard offered to pay. She refused, but accepted help with her application essay. She was studying social work, wanting to help people like herself, people the world had decided weren't worth believing. One spring evening, almost 6 months after Emily had walked into that boardroom, the three of them sat in the kitchen making cookies. Flour dusted the counters, chocolate chips scattered across the floor, and laughter filled the spaces where silence had once lived. "I have something for you," Emily said, pulling out a small wrapped box. Sophie opened it to find a salt dough ornament, a heart, imperfectly shaped, painted in rainbow colors. On the back, Emily had written, "For Sophie, who taught me that families are built with love, not rules." Sophie pressed it to her chest, tears streaming. "It's perfect. It's for your own tree," Emily explained, "for when you have your own place, so you remember us." "I could never forget you," Sophie whispered. Richard watched them, these two people who'd saved each other, and felt gratitude so profound it hurt. He'd learned that wealth meant nothing without compassion, that power without humility was just cruelty, that the most valuable things in life couldn't be bought or inherited. They had to be earned through showing up, listening, and having the courage to change. Outside, the garden was blooming. Flowers Claire had planted years ago, finally tended again. Richard had hired a gardener, but he worked alongside them now, learning the names of things, getting dirt under his fingernails, understanding that growth required patience and care. The Patek Philippe sat in a safe deposit box downtown. Richard hadn't worn it since that day in the boardroom. Someday, maybe he'd give it to Emily, or maybe he'd sell it and donate the money to Grace Haven. Either way, it no longer defined him. What defined him now was simpler: a man trying to be better, a father learning to love, a human being who'd discovered that dignity wasn't something you owned. It was something you recognized in others, especially those the world had taught you to overlook. In the kitchen, Sophie helped Emily read a recipe, their heads bent together, flour in their hair, joy in their voices. And Richard understood finally what Claire had tried to tell him before she died, that home wasn't a place or a possession. It was this moment, these people, this choice to keep showing up, to keep trying, to keep believing that broken things could be mended if you were willing to do the work. The sun set over Greenwich, painting the glass mansion in shades of gold. Inside, three people who'd learned about loss and judgment and grace sat together, creating something more precious than any heirloom. They were creating a family, and this time, they were getting it right. The end. Did you like this story? Would you have done anything differently? Tell me in the comments. See you next time. Don't forget to like and subscribe now to receive more exciting stories that you won't want to miss. Thank you very much.